It's a curious reality. If you reply to a post in English on any given forum, our American cousins tend to automatically assume that you're American. It's also curious that Californians seem to routinely believe that California is the centre of the world. Much like in the olden days, it was believed that the Earth was the centre of the universe. Well, all these worldviews are wrong, of course, because the actual centre of the universe is Wokingham, in the British Royal County of Berkshire. I left St Crispin's Comprehensive School in 1980 when I was 16 years old. Although I generally hated school, it's one of the greatest regrets of my life that I never went on to sixth form, as had I done so, I could have been so much happier. But alas, I was never a grade A student, and that, coupled with the dreadful mental health problems which nuked my third year of senior school, all meant that I was no one's first choice for sixth form, not even my own. A tragedy of missed opportunity. That first summer, without the worry of school or exams, I was truly free for the first and only time of my life. In that beautiful but tiny period of time without adult pressures, and still with enough child in me to play properly, I could be happy in my freedom. I had wanted to take a year out, as they say, but with Mum's strong, not to say ferocious work ethic, that was never going to happen. It's another of life's regrets, as this time is so fleeting, so unique. Once the opportunity for true freedom is gone, it can never really come back for most of us. So I got a job I hated, but back in the summer of 1980 I was free for just a few short months. I learned several valuable life lessons almost immediately. First among them was that being totally free without money is very frustrating. I've found that in the 60 plus years I've been on Earth, sometimes I've had short periods when I've had plenty of money, but I've not had the time to enjoy it. Other times there have been periods of comparative freedom in my life, but they correspond to being absolutely skint. For most of us, I suspect this is a rule of life. So in 1980 I found myself free but brassic. There used to be a venue in Wokingham called the King of Clubs, which offered a variety of leisure activities like a nightclub and a bowling alley. In 1980, the King of Clubs was looking to boost its daytime trade, so they offered bowling in the mornings at a rather incredible rate of just £1. Even though I was skint, a quid for bowling was a bargain, and I loved it. I wanted my friends to go every day, but it turns out they all had lives, so bowling didn't happen nearly as often as I'd wanted it to. But still, we enjoyed several fun times at the King of Clubs. I remember hurling that crazy heavy ball down the lanes, because we bowled on teenage testosterone, so only the massive £15 balls were good enough. I remember how frustratingly difficult it was, the bizarre scoring system, the overhead TVs and the iconic sounds. It was great fun indeed. I also remember the pin setters coming down and the bar that descended across the alley. It had AMF written on it. I was mildly surprised that a company could specialise in such a niche market, but I never wondered any more than that. I neither knew nor cared that in 1980 AMF were in the throes of selling the Harley-Davidson Motor Company. As far as my friends and I were concerned, the word motorcycle meant Japanese. There were no alternatives worth considering, certainly not the American Harley-Davidson. Harley were just a joke to us young motorcycle enthusiasts. They were massively overweight, very expensive, ridiculously slow and horribly unreliable. We would snigger behind the back of any Harley owner, as the brand wasn't just a joke, it was a bad joke. Harley-Davidson was little more than a term of derision. Then there was the British motorcycle, and by the 1980s that meant Triumph. If Harley-Davidson were a bad joke, Triumph was shamefully pathetic. Very symptomatic of the times, Triumph were doubly cursed with an almost psychotic unionism and dreadful, ignorant and ineffective management all at the same time. Triumph motorcycles could only dream of aspiring to the dizzy heights of bad joke. The significant difference between the Harley bad joke and the Triumph pathetic was that the Harley-Davidson dynasty recognised they couldn't solve their problems, and they sold the company to American Machine Foundry in 1969. We'll chart the incredible and treacherous voyage that the motor company sailed after the buyout in the next video. Here, it's suffice to note that the Vaughan Beals management team captained Harley-Davidson on to what has become incredible success. Triumph, on the other hand, sailed the ship of great British industry right to the bottom of the sea. Team Vaughan Beals bought the motor company from AMF in 1981. One of their top priorities was the Evolution engine, which finally emerged in 1984 on the Big Twins. It was a huge improvement over the previous generation shovelhead engines and helped keep the firm afloat, albeit in a sea of red ink, as Alan Girdler put it. Initially, the Sportster didn't benefit from this new engine, but all that changed in 1986. Back in 2021, Harley released this video called From Evolution to Revolution to publicise the new line of bikes based on the Revolution Max engine. The antithesis of this revolution was the evolution of 1984, and I can easily remember reading Harley-Davidson articles with the words evolution, not revolution, to emphasise that the newly updated engines were an evolution of the traditional shovelhead engine, not an entirely new product. What was true of the big twin Evo engines in 1984 was also true of the Sportster engines of 1986. They were an evolution of the old Ironhead engines, not a revolutionary new power plant. And like the rest of the 1986 Evo Sportster, nearly everything else was the same as the old Ironhead Sportster of 1985. And yet this evolution was still so profound it constituted a deep-seated revelation. To find out exactly what had evolved between the end of the Ironhead Sportster and the beginning of the evolution, you have to look very closely, or else you'll miss it. Alan Girdler says that the frame, for instance, was retained from as far back as 1982 with no changes at all except to the engine mounts. But the brakes, electrics, clutch and bodywork were all the same as the old Ironhead. He also notes that the engine was derived from the old flathead or side valve from 1929. This gained recirculating oil in 1937. It was made unit construction in 1952 and was given overhead valves in 1957, that is, for the Sportster. All that meant that the original 1929 configuration and outline had remained the same for 67 years and counting. This stretches even to the displacement, which in 1986 returned to the traditional 883cc by using the same cylinder dimensions as the original 1957 engine, a 3-inch bore with a 3.81-inch stroke. Since the term evolution pointedly refers to the engine, that's where we'll look for some element of newness, even though this 1986 Evolution, or Evo engine, was at its heart designed in 1929. Only Harley-Davidson are able to do this, as they can refresh the parts other manufacturers cannot reach. First, what Alan Girdler calls the major move was going from the fabled, tried and tested cast iron engine to all aluminium. Back in 1957, when the Sportster first emerged, cast iron was already old-fashioned, but it was strong enough to power the world's fastest production motorcycle by the mid-1960s. But in the 3+ decades since its inception, production and technology had moved on considerably even at Harley-Davidson, who had been producing aluminium engines for road bikes since the 1936 Knucklehead. During the turbulent 1970s, AMF had invested untold millions into the factories, especially at York in Pennsylvania and Milwaukee in Wisconsin. By 1986, quality control and production processes had improved to such a degree that design and manufacture of an all-aluminium Sportster engine was not just plausible, but greatly preferable. The aluminium alloy motor was so well engineered that, as Alan Girdler notes, the new 883cc engine could do the same amount of work as the old 1000cc Ironhead engine, but with less stress. Also, using aluminium offered significant weight savings over cast iron, but this was not the killer app, as we say nowadays. Aluminium is preferred because it also conducts heat more efficiently than iron. This is key because all air-cooled engines tend to struggle with cooling. Remember the old XR750 from the previous video? The engine was cast iron because racing engines needed to be strong, so it was a pocket rocket. In its first 2 years of production, it went really fast, until the engine exploded. While precise figures are difficult to find, it seems that the old iron engines revved very highly and had a compression ratio of 8.5 to 1. We've seen how desirable high compression is. Fuel compressed into a smaller space makes for a bigger bang and thus more power. Unfortunately, the downside to this is that higher compression also generates more heat. The Iron XR engines failed because they simply couldn't conduct the heat away fast enough and detonated. So in 1972, the cast iron engine was replaced with an aluminium engine. Because aluminium conducts heat so much better, it enables engines to run a very high compression ratio. The new engine generated a 10.1 compression ratio with an impressive scream at 8,000 RPM. Technological advances allowed aluminium engines to be perfectly strong enough even in 1972 and even for Harley-Davidson, so an all-aluminium Sportster engine was, with hindsight, obviously, just a matter of time. There were also changes to the flywheels and the valve lifters, or tappets, I believe, but I don't fully understand these, so we'll just have to gloss over them. The most important advance here is the new cylinder heads, which I also don't fully understand, but it's so significant we're just going to have to go there. In researching this complicated topic, it's become clear to me that in terms of the internal combustion engine development, there are two focal points, the cylinders and the heads. If we look at the cylinder itself, that is, the frilly bit directly beneath the head, it's actually fairly simple. In this 1910 Harley-Davidson Model 6A, the single cylinder is familiar enough. 10 years later, this 1920 Model JS is a recognisable V-twin, but the cylinders look much the same as the older model. The same is true of this 1930 Model V, once you see past all the paraphernalia. The first Model Ks in 1952 were also very similar. Although the Model V was a 1200cc and the Model K was a 750, the Model K cylinders look fatter because the fins are so much larger and there are more of them. Air-cooled cylinders like these are exposed to air moving over the fins, which cools the engine. Cylinders can also be liquid-cooled, as most cars are and as many modern motorcycles are. But they're all still easily recognisable as cylinders, which are just tubes at the end of the day, a tube with a piston inside. The tube can have lots of cooling fins, large or small, or it can be smooth if it's liquid-cooled. Different materials can be used to manufacture said tubes, like iron or aluminium, but they're still just tubes. It turns out that there's not really a whole lot you can do with a cylinder, so even over a century or more, they all look very similar. The second focal point is the cylinder head. If we look again at our 1910 Model 6A, the head is very small in relation to the narrow-finned cylinder, with a carburettor on the upper left and the exhaust on the lower right, in the inlet over exhaust configuration. This is also known as an F-head or a pocket valve design. The spark plug sticks out horizontally on the right side, which looks very bizarre today. Note that the extra long exhaust valve stem and spring are fully exposed at the bottom of the cylinder. If we look at the left side of the engine, the head and the cylinder barrel are indistinguishable, not least because they're cast as one single piece. This must have been a great technical challenge, as the casting process for cylinder heads today is very complex. The 1920 JS is also a twin-cylinder engine, although still in the inlet over exhaust configuration. The heads now sport vertical fins and the spark plug emerges at an angle from the top of the heads, and the clear uniformity between the cylinder and head indicates that they're still being cast as one single piece. The inlet valve in the head is operated mechanically from a cam within the engine, activated via a pushrod and rocker, which are both fully exposed to the weather, the dust and the grit. This ensured that they wore out quickly, they became very noisy and required constant oiling by hand. At least the extra long exhaust valve stem and spring are now fully enclosed though. With a second 10-year jump, the 1930 heads on this Model V look significantly different because the inlet over exhaust configuration is now gone, replaced with a new side valve design. The cylinders look different because the fins now extend further outwards and enclose the inlet and exhaust valve stems, which are both fully enclosed, although from the left they don't look so different from the old inlet over exhaust engines. The fins on the heads are still vertical, but significantly larger, and now they run front to back so the air can flow smoothly through them. As the name suggests, the side valve design places both exhaust and inlet valves right next to each other. The inlet valve is moved off the head and down to the cylinder side, which means the cylinder head itself needs to be wider to cover both valves. Here we can see two simplified engine diagrams. If we directly compare both the inlet over exhaust cylinder head with the side valve cylinder head, we can see what the principal difference is, the inlet valve. However, there is another key difference with the side valve engine which can't be seen. The cylinder barrel and the cylinder head are now cast separately as two individual pieces. As far as I can tell, this wasn't a new idea, as car engines already use separate castings for heads and barrels, but motorcycle engines seem to take a while to catch up, perhaps because car engines usually have more cylinders. In the side valve engine diagram, only one valve is illustrated, as the other is directly behind it, so can't be seen. Again, comparing the inlet over exhaust head with the side valve head, we can see that in spite of the different casting techniques, they're essentially the same shape. There's a sloping chamber roof on the left, with a raised combustion section, the crown, on the right, above the valve. In the diagrams, the inlet over exhaust engine has a longer slope. It's longer as it holds the inlet valve, where the side valve design has an extended flat section directly over the piston. This extended section is called a squish band. It's where the gases get squished extra hard as they're squirted into the main chamber, where it causes turbulence, which is a good thing apparently. In England in 1919, Harry Ricardo applied for a patent GB 148.046A, improvements in the cylinders of internal combustion engines. This detailed the squish band development in what he calls removable heads. He says that in a small area around the edge of the piston top there forms a layer of gas so chilled it does not burn completely. However, an engine with his patented removable turbulent heads offers greater power and economy and permits a much higher compression ratio. In his submission diagram, we can see the squish band in the side view, but he also adds a plan view showing the cylinder head. The raised area, the crown, houses a spark plug roughly in the centre and is shaped, he said, like a triangle with rounded ends. The overlap of the piston and cylinder is shown in dotted lines illustrating how the combustion occurs over the valves, not above the piston where it's really needed. Such is the major shortfall of both the inlet over exhaust and the side valve cylinder head designs. Another 10 development years later, by 1940, cylinder head designs have advanced further in two key areas. Previously, as shown in this photo of a Harley-Davidson cylinder head from the early 1930s, we can see what a convoluted shape the combustion chamber has to be. This is Harley-Davidson's version of a licensed genuine Ricardo turbulent head design which Harley bought the patent for. And since this head is nearly 100 years old, it's very rusty, which means it's made of cast iron. In the 1930s, the Harley-Davidson Model Vs and all the early Model W side valve engines were cast iron. The second key development in cylinder head design involved the valves once again. Even the notoriously technophobic Harley-Davidson had recognised that the future of head design lay in having the valves in the cylinder heads, not adjacent to each other in a pocket on the side of the barrels. In 1936, the famous Model E, or Knucklehead, was released with its all-aluminium engine with overhead valves, which represented a huge leap for Harley-Davidson engineers. By the 1950s, Harley recognised the need for a smaller, nimble, high-performance motorcycle, but came up with the heavy, low-powered and cumbersome Model K. Although Harley-Davidson had been producing overhead valve aluminium engines for the big twins for nearly 2 decades, the Model K had a cast-iron engine with side valves. But seeing how important overhead valve technology was, Harley leapt into action, and just 21 years after the Knucklehead was introduced, the Sportster was launched with overhead valves, but they still went with cast-iron cylinder heads as they didn't want to go too far, too fast, obviously. If we compare the various cylinder heads specifically, from the very early 1910 atmospheric inlet valve to the next generation inlet over exhaust, the 1920s JS, we can see the progression, though it's still clearly a variation on a theme. By 1930, the Model V series sported the newer side valve engines with the appreciably larger heads. Crucially, the heads and cylinders were now manufactured separately, and I imagine that casting and machining quality could improve significantly because of this. In 1957, the Sportster cylinder heads are quite unrecognisable when compared to previous designs. They're a strange shape and obviously larger now because the inlet and exhaust valves and rocker springs are all fully enclosed within the heads. The pushrod tubes, now emblazoned and polished, are clearly visible on the right side and have become a hugely important aesthetic feature on all modern Harley-Davidsons, except the Revolution Max bikes. With the head covers removed, we can see the inlet and exhaust valve springs angled outwards, with the very tops of the valves visible inside the springs. The fins still run front to back, some horizontal, some vertical, and the heads themselves are a much more complicated shape. If we turn them over, the crusted up with carbon valves are visible, with a small hole in the edge of the chamber for the spark plug. The key ingredient here is the shape. It's perfectly round as the chamber sits directly over the piston, so combustion occurs exactly where it's needed. This is identified as a hemispherical design, and variations of this are almost always used in modern engines, usually with overhead camshafts as well, although we won't be going there. This design is preferable in almost every way, with only one detrimental aspect. Now that the exhaust valve has been moved into the cylinder head, the ultra-hot gases go up out of the cylinder through the head before exiting the exhaust manifold. This makes for a very hot cylinder head. Air-cooled Harley-Davidson engines like these all struggle with cooling, and today, with Harley factory engines reaching 2 litres and more, heat becomes a serious problem. For the Sportster, with its smaller engine, this is less of a problem, but it is still an issue. Comparatively speaking, the cylinder of the internal combustion engine hasn't changed much in over a century. The same can't be said of the heads, however. Harley introduced their first V-twin engines between 1907 and 1910, which produced around 7 horsepower, By 1920, although still cast in one piece with the cylinders, the improved heads enabled engines to deliver about 17 horsepower. By 1930, the VL could produce 30 horsepower with their side valves and Ricardo's turbulent heads. By 1965, the Sportster's overhead valved XLCH engine doubled that to around 60 horsepower. Nearly all this advance was gained from the heads, not the cylinders. In 1919, company co-founder William S. Harley applied for patent number 1,472,068. His new engine design aimed to provide uniform correlated expansion of the constituent parts which would eliminate errors of timing in a lightweight motor. Cost and technical problems meant that aluminium alloy engines weren't able to enter some mainstream manufacturing until the 1930s, when Harley-Davidson were able to launch their knucklehead. Its overhead valves and aluminium engine, there was nothing new here, but it did represent a major leap forward for the company. But even in 1919, William Harley knew that the future of engines was aluminium. With hindsight, it seems that Harley-Davidson took the line of least resistance by going with cast iron for the Sportster in 1957, and they really lucked out. Those famous old ironheads were awesomely strong, which was what enabled the XLCH to become the greatest motorcycle in the world. However, for over 2 decades before the Sportster existed, Harley-Davidson had been producing fully enclosed overhead valve aluminium engines for their knuckle and pan heads, rather than the overhead valve racers of the 1910s and 20s, which were cast iron with exposed valves. Thus, even in 1957, cast iron really was very old hat. So, in classic Harley fashion, the motor company leapt into action. Seeing the need, and recognising the success of the aluminium overhead valve technology of 1936 with lightning-like reflexes, the Harley-Davidson Sportster finally got all aluminium overhead valve engine just 50 years later. In addition to the change from cast iron to aluminium, the new all-important Evolution Sportster benefited from small but important design changes too. The old cast iron cylinder heads had a very high crown, making for an enlarged combustion chamber with a comparatively huge dome. A high combustion chamber crown allows for much larger valves, but because the chamber volume also increases, the all-important compression ratio suffers. To counter this, ironhead Sportsters use what were commonly called dome pistons, which utilise a large, somewhat ugly raised top. This allowed the piston to compress the gases more deeply into the chamber, thus preserving the compression ratio. In comparison to other pistons like these from a 1970s Honda CB750, the ironhead pistons certainly look odd. Comparing a 1969 cast iron rear cylinder head to a 1987 Evolution rear, we can see the difference, though it's not easy. The larger valves, on the right, seal the inlet port, and if you look carefully, it does sit more deeply into the 1969 crown than in the corresponding 1987 version. But we're looking at the 1986 Sportster specifically, and there's a further complication. Naturally. New for 1986, the 883 Sportster's combustion chamber was actually not hemispherical. They were what was known as bathtub shaped. Here's a genuine Harley Sportster rear head, number 16662-86 for the 1986 model. Note that it has a rim around the chamber. If we look at Hammer Performance's photo of another 1986 head, we can see more clearly the rim, or the squish band, as a cylinder overlap is shown by a discoloration ring around the bathtub chamber. Although hemispherical head chambers are better than any side valve chamber, turbulence is still a positive element of combustion, so a squish band in an overhead valve engine is often still desirable. This diagram from Wikipedia shows a squish band in a hemispherical head. As we've just seen, there are actually 2 different cylinder heads for the Sportster XL in 1986, part numbers 16662-86 and 16698-86. 6 weeks after the new Evolution Sportster XLH 883 was officially launched, fans got a pleasant surprise. The new XLH 1100 joined its stablemate. Suddenly, not only was the Sportster benefiting from pucker late 20th century engineering, it was also going to be the largest capacity Sportster ever, 1100 beautiful cc's. As we noted earlier, the traditional 883cc engine had a 3-inch bore and a 3.81-inch stroke, meaning that the piston moved up and down 3.81 inches and the cylinder had a diameter of 3 inches. If you do the maths, this equates to 26.93 cubic inches for each cylinder, or 53.9 cubic inches in total, which is 883cc. However, if you increase the bore diameter to 3.5 inches, the total displacement increases to 67.16 cubic inches or 1100cc. There were several other changes, minor and tedious mostly, like hydraulic tappets, 34mm Cayenne carburetor, and the frame got powder coated. In America at least, the indicators also doubled as running lights, but I don't know if this carried over to Britain. An optional Deluxe 883 offered a dual seat, passenger footrest, spoke wheels, and a tachometer with a pretty paint job, features which are all standard on the new 1100s. Later in the year, a limited Liberty Edition bike was offered to celebrate the centenary of the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. Or, according to Bruce Springsteen, it's actually in New Jersey. The Liberty bikes were all 1100s with a representation of the statue on the tank and on the front mudguard. There was just one more detail which made absolutely sure that the new Evolution Sportster would be a smash hit. The price. Back in 1983, Harley-Davidson, who were deep in the struggle to survive after the buyout of 1981, recognised the need to generate higher sales. They released the bare-bones Sportster XLX 61, which retailed for just $4,000 in America. Harley clearly saw the same need 3 years later. But what would they do? The answer was exactly the same. Despite rising inflation, the new Evo Sportster XLH 883 was offered for sale at just $3,995. A stunner of a bargain. The previous year, the 1985 base model Ironhead cost $4,795. If ever there was a Harley that enables riders to quit pretending, this was surely it. Sales for 1986 more than doubled over the previous year to well over 14,000, the best figure since 1980, with the budget-priced XLH 883 selling a whopping 8,000 units. We saw that Alan Girdler recognised the new 1986 Evolution Sportster to be substantially the same as the old Ironhead. In fact, he noted that the whole chassis was the same as the 1982 model, so clearly all the new must be focused on the engine. What was new here is invisible to the rider. In a word, the new here is quality. That is, quality control for the product off the production line, as well as top quality in the manufacturing and design processes. Today we take these things for granted in vehicles, as we should. But it wasn't until 1969 when Sakura Honda released the incredible CB750 on the world that customers realised they could have a good price and top quality all in one motorcycling product. Harley-Davidson managed this within 15 years, Triumph within 20. However, for Harley-Davidson in 1977, this required engineer Hank Hubbard to design an oil-tight, powerful and cheap 100,000-mile engine, although, he says, 2 other guys gave birth to the Evo, Bob Sroker and Dave Webster. This was during the AMF tenure of the motor company. It'll come as no surprise to read that Chief Engineer Don Valentine said cylinder heads were the biggest challenge. But this challenge was met in the face of incredible technical and financial obstacles, and the Evolution engine arrived to power the Sportster for the 1986 model year. It's curious that in this modern world, with the evils of the bean counters everywhere, numbers are not the focus for the new Evo engines. Most sources say that the Evolution power figures don't offer much of an improvement over the Ironhead figures. So, for instance, the Evo 883 is a little less powerful than the old 1000cc Ironhead, but the Evo 1100 is a little more powerful. It seems then that Sportster riders no longer cared about the fastest or the most powerful, the bean counting of motorcycling. We care about the most important element of motorcycling, happiness. For us, the Sportster model and the Harley-Davidson brand constitutes a whole emotional side. The brand, the relationship with riders and dealers, and the styling. These are what make us strong. That's how Willie G. Davidson conveys the happiness of motorcycling, or, more specifically, the happiness of Harley-Davidson motorcycling. For Willie G., motorcycling begins with emotion, and even faith. For Sportster riders, happiness and faith are focused on one single model. I've read Sportster passion described as a culture, specifically a wholly separate subculture within the greater Harley-Davidson superculture. Sportster fans say, "I didn't want a Harley and bought a Sportster. I wanted a Sportster, so I bought a Harley." For Willie G., emotion, style and relationships make a strong brand. Sportster riders are happy to ride their bikes. They're all conscious of an imperceptible link, almost ethereal, that engrafts them into the Sportster culture. And they love how their bikes look. As has been noted many times before, the heart of a vehicle is its engine. Sportster XLs have always had beautiful engines. Look at this pristine 1957 bike that was auctioned at Meekham not so long ago. Ignore the big, round, beautiful air cleaner cover and see the engine. 2 pushrod tubes set into each barrel, nicely shaped cylinder heads and the classic snail's head housing for the generator. These are quintessential Sportster attributes. If we look at the left-hand side of the bike, the most beautifully sculptured cylinders are revealed. They're sumptuous, almost sensuous. See how the hips are wide at the top and taper down to a slender base like a gorgeously feminine silhouette. If that sounds trite, let's compare that classy gal to an Indian Challenger engine, for example. This Power Plus engine is top quality, and it is nice, but it hasn't got the aesthetic appeal that a Sportster engine has. Visually, it's just a well-presented box. The Challenger engine, it might as well be a battery, and a battery certainly could look like that. Or, for instance, what about a Honda Rebel 1100? Firstly, it's not immediately clear where the cylinders are here. When you do identify them, they are a box. And look at all those pipes and hoses. This motorcycle must have the best plumbing in the world. I bet it'd make a great toilet. All the Sportster engines are beautiful by comparison, and the Sportster Evo even improved on the Ironhead by cleaning up the lines. Look at this 1990 XLH. I chose it because it's beaten half to death, but it's still gorgeous. Ignore the balancer or crossover pipe on the exhaust for the moment. It did a good job, apparently. Behind that pipe, and the non-standard air filter cover shown here, the cylinder barrels have a sharper profile compared to the Ironhead, especially at the top, directly beneath the heads, where the fins are more uniform. The heads themselves are also neater. If we look at the left sides especially, the Evo heads are a squarish shape where the Ironheads are a C shape, which leaves them open on the left. Below the heads, the Ironheads might actually be considered more beautiful as the fins are more regular, which just accentuates that fabulous feminine silhouette. Either way, the Sportster engine is gorgeous, as are all the Evolution engines, and its quality design and manufacture make it wonderfully functional too. If the heart of the beast is gorgeous, then the beast itself has got to have a good chance. Boys and girls, this is the Evo Sportster.